Our next speaker is Noel Child, who will be talking about how the ventilation systems will operate and draw on some international comparisons. Noel is an independent transport, energy and environmental services professional. He works with University of Technology and also his own consulting company, Noel Child and Associates. He specialises in environmental engineering and management, environmental assessment, air quality assessment, and a whole lot of very big other words. You've made presentations to a number of international conferences and seminars on subjects including road tunnel ventilation, airport developments, high-speed rail technologies and applications, and alternative fuel and energy options and systems. Noel is experienced in the evaluation of innovative technologies, products and systems, and in the investigation, assessment and development of related marketing opportunities and strategies. He's also a member of the judging panel of the Engineering Excellence Awards presented by the Sydney Division of Engineers Australia. Please welcome Noel Child.
After that, I hope I can work this little machine. But I'd simply like to thank you all again, as has been said before, for coming. It's very important. Certainly like to thank Ray for his contribution, which I think was obviously important. And my purpose is simply to try and add a background about how tunnels work, which interrelates very closely with what Ray had to say, to try and add some information and some knowledge in an area where sadly it's been my observation that those that are building and promoting these projects fail to do for one reason or another. As I say, I simply want to try and paint, and I'll paint with a fairly big brush because it's a big topic and we've got limited time, a description of just what the major issues, in my opinion, are with tunnels and what people should be looking for, what the builders of tunnels should be concerned about, and certainly what the community should be concerned about. In an ideal world, of course, those two things come together. The North Connect's evidence seems to indicate that's not the case. I just quickly, by way of background, put up this slide which shows where our existing road tunnel networks are, and we've had some experience, but mostly with short-length tunnels. We've recently, or relatively recently, opened the Cross City Tunnel and the Lane Cove Tunnel. Ray referred to the Lane Cove Tunnel. They're short tunnels, so I'll come to a summary of length in a minute, and they've so far been reasonably adequately ventilated and reasonably adequate performing, although there is now evidence emerging that that may not be the case at Lane Cove. But the price for that was that to get the projects up and running, traffic figures were fairly grossly overstated, and as you're all probably aware, both the initial investment groups in those tunnels went broke or sent some other people's money up the spout, and the projects were relaunched. Those tunnels, the Harbour Tunnel is a 1.3 kilometre tunnel, the Eastern Distributor 2.1 kilometres of actual tunnel with some cut and cover extensions out along Southern Cross Drive towards the airport. The M5 East, which has been a very problematic tunnel, 4.2 kilometres, but it's really each way 2.1 kilometres bolted together, and it's ventilated in two halves, and for all that, when the traffic built up, there were major problems there in the second of the westbound lanes, sections. Lane Cove Tunnel, about 3.4 kilometres, and the Cross City Tunnel, 2.3 that I mentioned. And these are mainly longitudinally ventilated, and it's important to talk a little bit about what that is. Before I come to that, I want to reinforce something Ray said in relation to the North Connects. This is our first movement. This is a tunnel near completion into a long tunnel, something like 9 kilometres, that will be very heavily trafficked. Anyone that's familiar with the Pennant Hills Road link and the link between the M2 and the Pacific Highway to the north understands two things. One, the very urgent need to do something about that traffic impasse, and two, the fact that whatever mechanism, and it will be a tunnel that takes that traffic, will be very, very busy. A lot of trucks. And Australia's truck fleet's not the newest in the world, so that the emissions will be higher, possibly higher than what are modelled. This once again is a longitudinally ventilated tunnel, and I'll come in just a moment to explain that term. There's no air treatment proposed. Emission stacks, one at each end, so the situation is that the traffic goes into each tunnel tube, The air's pushed along with a bit of fan assistance, but maybe mainly pushed along by the vehicles themselves, a so-called piston effect. And as you get further into that, bearing in mind the Lane Cove tunnel, where problems are starting to show up in a lightly trafficked tunnel after 3 kilometres, has the same strategy, the same ventilation strategy. Here we push past 3 kilometres, 4 kilometres to 9 kilometres. We do that by just pushing all of the emissions and everything right up to the end of the tunnel. And as Ray pointed out, and I think the figures are optimistic, we see a particular level of 50 times what's reasonably recommended. And Ray quite properly pointed out that this is not just a trivial matter, but that type of excess is potentially very, very harmful. Now, Ray's talked about this. The point I want to make here is that, in my view, there are really 2 very important issues to consider and that you should bear in mind in your own thinking about this particular challenge. And the first one, in my opinion, and obviously the question of stacks and pollution around stacks becomes very emotive, as it should be, it's important. But the problem starts inside the tunnel. If you get the ventilation wrong inside the tunnel, that's where the pollutants are sourced. And while the stacks can have very harmful effects in the radius around them, if you get the air wrong inside the tunnel, everyone that uses the tunnel is exposed. And you'll probably see, and the only constructive debate that I've seen coming out of health and transport recently was how small the sign should be on the M5 East that said, "Hold your breath, wind the windows up, don't let any air into your car." Now that's a fairly telling thing. I notice on the Lane Cove tunnel it's now up in rather bigger electronic form. But the difficulty with this is not everyone will hold their breath, not everyone will have their windows up, and not everyone will reverse the air conditioning so that there's no air coming in. And the risk is, if you're at the end of a tunnel like the North Connects, based on the figures of the proponents and the developers themselves, which, as I say, are optimistic, your car is a captive vessel for a mass of air with all the risks that Ray pointed out, including a major pollutant that's 50 times the level it's deemed safe. And it takes a while to clear out of your vehicle, and there are short-term effects as well as long-term effects. Now, there are some options, and I guess the main point of my talk is to inform you and hope to convince you that it is terribly important to change the current government thinking that there's nothing to see here, there's no problem, we'll just go ahead and do this. There is something very real to see in the potential problems. There's 2 ways really that you ventilate a tunnel. One is by longitudinal ventilation. One is by transverse ventilation. I'll just throw a diagram up, and they're very simplistic, but longitudinal is the cheapest way to do it. You simply pour air into one end of the tunnel. You have all the traffic going in one direction, so you have 2 parallel tubes. The vehicles and some fans push that air along, and as the vehicles progress along the tunnel and they emit pollutants in their exhausts, that builds up and is pushed further along. And you can add more air and push it further. If you choose to, you can take some air out, but then you've got to introduce another stack. And I know for a fact that the thinking of the government is, well, the less stacks, the better. If I've only got 1 stack at the end of the tunnel, I've only got 1 meeting to deal with. If I start to put in too many, I've got more meetings. So longitudinal works for short tunnels. It's sort of working for the cross-city tunnel, but not many cars. It's sort of working for the Lane Cove tunnel, but there's a few cracks showing around the foundations, I think, based on those figures that Ray put up. But it's cheap, and you just cut a tunnel, you push the air in, you push the cars along, you take the air out the end. Come in a minute to the question of what happens at the stack. The more sophisticated way is called transverse ventilation, where you progressively wash air across the traffic, take the air out continuously, add fresh air so that you're ensuring that the air quality in the tunnel stays good. You've still got to deal with the air that you flush out with the exhausts, but you've taken it out into a tube. For example, it's positioned under the roadway or at the side, so that instead of, and it's I guess a bit like a difference between a coal miner having a shower and a bath. If he gets in the bath, it's him and the muck. It's still there. It's loosened, but he's floating around in it. That's longitudinal. Transverse is a bit like a shower. You're transversely washing the material away and taking it away. At the end, you've still got to deal with what washes off. But in the case of a tunnel, at least by that means, if you need to do it, and I suspect with long tunnels we may, you can be assured of clean air in the tunnel. Still got the question of disposing of the effluent. Just come back to that previous one. There's also the availability of air cleaning or treatment at stacks, as Ray pointed out, for particulates, for hydrocarbon residues and nitrogen dioxide. And the reason I went back to that, one additional problem with these very fine particulates, in addition to all the very worrying things Ray mentioned, is they have the capacity to adsorb onto their surface some of these other materials. So as well as all those difficulties, the heavy metals, etc., adsorbed onto the surface of those particles that showed up in the white cell from that young lass's lung, adsorbed onto the surface can be benzene, which is a carcinogen, and a whole range of other chemicals, because they have although they're tiny in molecular terms, have a massive surface area and a great potential to cause difficulty. Simply reinforces what Ray says. There's a system of semi-transverse ventilation. I won't stop on it. The real point I wanted to make is you can either do it the cheap way, push it all along, take it out at the end, or you can be a bit more sophisticated. So the problems, I think, are these: how you ventilate the tunnel, and it's really important. And my observation has been that the government, and this has spanned two governments, not a political comment, it's just a comment about governance, have taken the view that the way to deal with discussions is to send along a fairly junior, flaky PR person and not to treat the community with the respect they deserve. I think they misread the community. They see the community as a lot of dills. I see the community as an increasingly sophisticated group that if they're convinced something's a reasonable project, we'll move on. Everyone's busy. We've got plenty of things to do. But the mushroom principle doesn't quite work, and I think that's what's being played. Certainly, I think, Ray, that was the evidence at North Connect, still is. You've got the question of the exhaust emissions. That's a problem that needs to be solved. You've got the health impacts Ray talked about. We know that those emissions are harmful to health. You couldn't hear a more concerning summary of that than we just did. The risks increase with concentration, but as Ray said, there's no known safe lower limit, but you know as you get it up, and if you get up to 50 times the World Health Organisation recommended limit, the ice is getting a bit thin under the overweight skater, you know, you're likely to go through this thing. Even within the state government themselves, I mentioned the need to put warning signs on tunnels to advise people to be very careful about not getting this air into their car. So there's concerns within the government itself about these matters. There's certainly concerns within the medical profession widely, just catalogued. The National Environment Protection Measure, the NEPM, is confirming increasingly the danger of diesel pollution, and that these limits, as they stand now, are likely to come down because the recent emerging medical evidence is of great concern. And I think the greatest problem is that in this whole important episode, there's almost, it seems to me, an arrogant contempt for the public, an unwillingness to introduce the public to the facts that they're entitled to have and should have to make an informed decision. I don't share the government's view that it's dangerous to provide information. I think an empowered public is a terribly strong ally. It seems to me there shouldn't be a difference between the government position in this and your position and mine. You want it done properly. Separately, you want to know whether it really need to do it at all, but just for the moment, let's assume it's a terrific idea to build a tunnel. Well, let's do it properly. Tunnel ventilation, I talked about the two systems of ventilation. I'm not seeing any evidence that there's any proper evaluation of anything other than the cheapest and lowest cost methodology. Exhaust emissions we've discussed, health impacts we've discussed, particulates we've discussed. All of those things are real concerns, but I think there's some solutions. And the first one is modelling. I'll get to a bit of detail in a minute. Best practice tunnel ventilation, you'd have thought that's a given, and it isn't. Stacks and filtration, it seems to me very obvious that if you can identify a risk, and I don't know how much further you've got to go than Ray went to identify a risk, then you must apply the technology that's available to you to resolve the risk, assuming that's a good project. Air quality monitoring, you need to know. I notice in recent years there's been an attempt, certainly in New South Wales, around Sydney, to shut down the monitoring. In other words, don't let any facts get out there to bugger the story out. Because that upsets the PR people when they come in with the A4 piece of paper and the flaky stuff on it. And I'm a bit of a believer that what you need in this is more facts, not less. We need some independent oversight, and I'll tie that into modelling. I think if you're thinking about tunnels, you're thinking about these issues, we've got to think about transport policy priorities very generally and broadly, because otherwise I think we get into a great chase your tail exercise of more roads, more tunnels. You've got to serve the community, but how far down the track of making a city unlivable do you go? And I think that's a real issue, and in the background that needs to be juxtaposed against an individual project. Come back to respect for the public. Now, the modelling thing's important, and I'll probably close on it because I'm running out of time and there's time for questions later, but there are a couple of very good organisations in the world armed with modern IT technology that can take any proposed tunnel and model it with a huge degree of accuracy in terms of its ventilation, as you'd expect in the modern age. They can change variables like the traffic mix, like the level of exhaust emissions, like where the air's drawn out, and identify where the problems in the tunnel are. In the North Connect is a pretty simple one. It's straight, and the further you get into it, the worse it gets. But in a more complex tunnel, like the ones that are proposed here, you need that sort of modelling. It seems to me it would be in everyone's interest, including the government's, but perhaps not the ultimate operators of these things, if in the construction that modelling was developed at arm's length from government, available to the public, used by the government to inform their design decisions, used by the government to ensure that if the project's a good project in terms of transport outcomes, then it's built properly, that it doesn't carry with it a downside of health impacts for people near stacks, or more particularly for every bugger that uses the tunnel because of the question of inadequate ventilation. That modelling, I don't think it's something that should be hidden from the public. I think it should be openly presented to the public, and getting to that very important point of respect for the public, to treat all members of the public, community groups such as yourselves, as important stakeholders, which you are, but which is denied you at the moment, and as important allies and as contributors. Governments don't get everything right, and at the moment there's a very unfortunate tendency that's always been present in government, I don't think it's ever been worse, that the only message they get internally is the message of reinforcement. That the path to promotion is, what do you want to hear? Yeah, I can do that for you. What sort of report, what outcome do you want? I can get you that. And the big consulting companies, you give me a summary of what you want on the executive summary and a couple of $100,000, I'll give you a kilo of report. They've got machines that churn them out. Now, it probably sounds very cynical, and I'm sure there are some very good bits of work being done around the place, but in terms of politicised issues, that tends to happen, unfortunately. International experience is a bit different to ours. Of all of these, I think the important one is Japan, where there is now concluding a very major road tunnel system or highway system, including 18 kilometres of road tunnel under Tokyo. Japan's economy has been flatlining, as we know, for several decades. I don't think there's much evidence that they're a country or have been governed by people who like throwing money away, but they have ensured that the ventilation in those tunnels is transverse, that the air within the tunnel is in strict compliance with the tightest possible regulations. There's discharge points every kilometre or so, all treated. So while this is running through the city, they have gained the support of the community that what comes out of these vent stacks is clean air, and the outcome that's delivered is clean air in your tunnel, and of course the transport outcome that's very necessary. Now, it seems odd to me that another developed country could view this challenge and see such a different outcome. Most odd. That's just a quick picture of something that happens in Spain with these treated tunnels. Down here you've got two transport lanes, and they are able to take the air out, treat it, and not introduce a stack, but reduce the level of pollution such that the air is discharged just through vents in a landscaped area that's been developed as a parkland where the roadways used to be. Their whole purpose was to put the roads underground so they recover some of the surface for lifestyle purposes. So if you get it clever enough, you can eliminate the step. Now, I'm not saying that would work here necessarily, but it's an indication of what does occur. There's also options to treat air within tunnels, in other words, and not a bad idea if you've got an issue that can't be solved some other way by roof-mounted technology that can effectively remove pollution, and that has the advantage, if it can be made to work in a particular design, of both keeping the air in the tunnel clean and ensuring the air at the end of the tunnel for discharge has minimal pollutants. So there's the key considerations that I think come into this. I believe policy-wise, if we're going to get tunnels right, we want a much more balanced and integrated approach to transport generally. That if you look at a city like Sydney, yes, you need to solve road congestion problems, but you want to be careful in solving the road congestion problems so you don't actually just create more for the future. So there's a need to carefully think about roads and rail. I see with concern, because I've spoken about it a lot of times over the years, that there's now an acceptance that, well, yeah, the population is growing faster than we thought, and heck, the easiest way is just to have the people in Sydney and Melbourne, few in the other coastal cities. Just too hard for federal government and others to think about regional development. So when you look at Sydney and you have a choice between a high-speed rail infrastructure investment and a second airport that might be very problematic economically, well, you just go the easy way. Although high-speed rail, certainly in Japan, since we use them as an example for the tunnel, shows that jobs, societies and communities of critical mass, not country towns, but regional cities of 200,000 or 300,000 people with their own infrastructure and universities and galleries and so on, can grow up along the path of such a system. They don't grow up under airline tracks. And as a policy, for heaven's sake, treat the public as a stakeholder in this, not as a group of people to be dealt with in a PR sense. In terms of air quality, I can't add any more effectively to what Ray said. Air quality must be safeguarded. It can be by the way it's monitored and by the way the tunnels are ventilated, and if necessary, and it may well be necessary, by filtering or treating air that's discharged. It seems to me that, in a sense, a tunnel does have the capacity to capture pollutants, and having captured them, why release them again when all of those risks that Ray pointed out applied? Why not knock them on the head while you've got them in the one place? And in terms of ventilation, all of the comments I've made I think apply, and I'd like to encourage you to think about it. But why shouldn't you expect best practice in terms of the ventilation? If the project's worth doing, it has to bear the cost of being done properly. You put the right strength concrete into a building, it would be cheaper to do it with plasticine maybe, but you don't want it to fall down. So if you're going to do a project, there's a certain minimum standard that you should meet, I would have thought. Thank you very much, and I encourage you.